He was young, disciplined, and already on his third year in the Luftwaffe. 24-year-old Hans Keller had flown over these mountains countless times, but on the morning of February 17, 1944, something felt different. The air hung strangely still over the base in northern Italy, a pale blue dawn stretching across the horizon as Hans adjusted his leather gloves and climbed into the cockpit of his Messerschmitt Bf 109. It was supposed to be a routine reconnaissance flight over the Alps, nothing complicated, nothing dangerous, just photographs, weather observations, and a return before noon. He taxied down the runway, the engine roaring to life in a thunderous growl, then lifted into the sky, slicing through clouds like a silver blade. The ground crew watched him ascend until he disappeared into the morning haze. They expected to see him again by lunchtime. They never did. Minutes turned into hours, and hours into a creeping dread that settled like frost across the hangars. At 10:18 a.m., Hans made brief radio contact, a crackle of static, a few words that didn't quite make sense, and then silence. No distress call, no mention of mechanical failure, no request for emergency procedures, just static swallowing him whole. As the sun climbed higher, command sent out repeated transmissions. None returned. A search team was scrambled but found nothing, no plumes of smoke rising from valleys, no metallic glint on mountaintops, no parachute caught in pine trees. It was as if Hans Keller had been erased mid-flight. Weather conditions were crisp, visibility clear. Allied aircraft sightings were non-existent in that sector. Locals in distant mountain villages claimed they heard something overhead that morning, a low droning hum swallowed by the wind, but nothing was ever confirmed. In war, planes vanished often, but this disappearance puzzled even hardened officers. Aircraft didn't simply evaporate, not without a trace, not without a reason. His bunk remained untouched, his flight log open on the last recorded entry, pencil marks indicating he double-checked his mission coordinates 3 times. It was the kind of meticulousness that made him one of the Luftwaffe's most reliable pilots. And yet, reliability meant nothing against whatever swallowed him that day. When investigators later reviewed Hans Keller's final radio message, what they found raised more questions than answers. The transmission lasted less than 5 seconds, punctuated by uneven static that didn't match expected atmospheric interference for that region. Radio operators described it as unnatural, a sound like distant thunder layered over steel scraping against steel. The recovered audio transcription read, "Clouds, coming, from," then a violent burst of static cut it off. No coordinates, no scripted identifiers, no request for assistance, just a fragmented sentence ending abruptly as if the signal had been forcibly severed. Wartime archives show that radio failures in that alpine sector were rare. Even during storms, transmissions usually carried through with distortion, not total blackout. Meteorological reports from that morning showed mild winds and stable ionospheric conditions, making the sudden drop-off statistically unlikely. Investigators replayed the recording dozens of times in dimly lit rooms, leaning close as if proximity could reveal something they missed. One analyst swore he heard a faint second voice beneath Hans's fading words, a muffled echo or whisper, but the audio was too degraded to confirm. Another expert proposed that Hans might have encountered a sudden electrical surge, perhaps caused by malfunctioning equipment. But flight records showed his aircraft had undergone maintenance only days before and had passed safety checks flawlessly. Others theorized jamming from Allied forces, but intelligence logs showed no Allied aircraft or jamming units anywhere near the Alps that morning. Something else bothered investigators: the timing. Hans radioed in exactly 6 minutes after entering a region known for rapid cloud formation near glacial peaks. His final message hinted at something approaching or forming ahead of him. Yet cloud patterns that day were calm. No buildup, no storms rolling in. What did he see that wasn't on any weather chart? A few officers believed he encountered a fast-forming mountain fog, a phenomenon known to distort spatial perception. But fog doesn't cut radio signals. Fog doesn't erase aircraft mid-air. By evening, Authorities locked the recorded message inside a classified file, stamped with wartime secrecy. It hinted at something they could not explain, something that left a pilot speaking into static before being swallowed by silence. Hans Keller's last words weren't a distress call. They were a warning one nobody understood. In the days following Hans Keller's disappearance, meteorologists attached to the Luftwaffe combed through weather logs, atmospheric charts, and pilot reports from surrounding bases. What they uncovered didn't match the calm conditions that had been recorded before Hans took off. According to archive data, pressure readings from observation posts in the Alps shifted dramatically at 10:15 a.m., only 3 minutes before Hans's final transmission. A sudden drop, the kind that signals violent atmospheric disturbance. But the anomaly wasn't detected until hours later, when charts were updated and radio logs reviewed. By then, Hans's aircraft had already vanished into air that no longer behaved according to any known pattern. Witness accounts trickled in from remote alpine villages, shepherds, woodcutters, and mountaineers who spent decades navigating the peaks. One shepherd claimed he saw the sky turn black like a curtain being pulled shut, swallowing the morning light within seconds. Another man swore he heard thunder without clouds, a low rumble that rolled across the peaks followed by a sharp flash. But what haunted investigators wasn't the storm's violence, it was its speed. Mountain storms form quickly, but not instantaneously. Not with such ferocity, not with such silence afterward. The Luftwaffe's weather officers later identified the event as a supercell anomaly, a fast-forming storm system capable of generating unpredictable wind shear strong enough to tear aircraft from stable flight paths. But even that classification felt like guesswork. No photographs existed, no intact weather instruments survived the war to confirm the theory. Only scattered reports, fading memories, and a pilot's final words hinting at clouds coming from somewhere they weren't supposed to be. Experienced pilots like Hans were trained to navigate through sudden weather shifts, yet something about this storm didn't follow the rules. It didn't build, it appeared, it didn't drift, it engulfed. If the storm swallowed him, why were there no fragments? No oil slick on snowfields? No metallic debris found in valleys or on ridgelines? Even a catastrophic crash leaves scars, smoke, flames, shattered metal, but the Alps were silent, clean, undisturbed, as if the storm hadn't just destroyed an aircraft but consumed it whole. The mystery deepened. Had Hans Keller flown into a phenomenon that even experts couldn't explain, or had something else hidden behind the storm's sudden formation? As investigators pushed deeper into the disappearance, a chilling discovery emerged from the Bundesarchiv decades later. Hans Keller's file, buried among thousands of routine reports, was stamped Hochgeheim, top secret, not routine, not expected, not normal. Wartime losses were common, and reconnaissance pilots frequently vanished, but most cases were logged, investigated briefly, and closed. Hans's file, however, was sealed for 51 years. Why classify a missing pilot as if he were carrying state secrets? Declassified documents revealed that on the evening of his disappearance, officers from a special intelligence division visited the base. They confiscated Hans's logbooks, maps, maintenance records, and even personal letters from his locker. Ground crew were instructed not to discuss the flight. Radios were checked, and the crash investigation was halted within 48 hours, unheard of during wartime. Something about Hans's mission had rattled higher command. One memo written in terse, clipped handwriting warned, "Information regarding Keller flight path deviation is not to be disclosed. Treat as priority-level incident." Deviation? That word became the cornerstone of the cover-up. Hans wasn't where he was supposed to be when he vanished. Even worse, an internal map showed his last estimated position deep within forbidden airspace, far from his assigned route. A location marked only by a black X and the phrase Sperrgebiet restricted zone. What was in that zone? And why did the Luftwaffe act as if Hans had stumbled onto something he shouldn't have? Rumors rippled through surviving staff decades later. Some whispered Hans had been reassigned to a covert reconnaissance mission involving new experimental Allied technology. Others believed he had intercepted communications from resistance groups in the mountains. But the most unsettling theory came from a retired intelligence officer who insisted Hans saw something in the sky that day, something command couldn't explain and would never admit. In the end, one truth remained. The German military didn't hide routine losses. They hid threats unknown, unexplained, or inconvenient. Hans Keller's disappearance wasn't merely a tragedy. It was something the Reich feared enough to bury in silence. By the time the sun dipped behind the jagged alpine peaks on the night of Hans Keller's disappearance, the storm that had darkened the sky earlier in the day had dissolved into an eerie quiet. The mountains, usually humming with distant avalanches and echoing winds, stood strangely still. In the valley below, the small village of San Martino lit candles in windows, their flickering glow reflecting off snowdrifts piled against stone walls. It was there, among cracked cobblestone streets and smoke drifting from chimneys, that rumors first began to take shape. Old villagers claimed they saw something unnatural in the sky that evening, not a fireball, not an explosion, just a dark mass moving silently overhead, swallowed by swirling snow. A farmer tending his goats near the ridge said he caught sight of a shadow falling from the clouds, a shape that drifted downward with no sound, no flame, nothing to indicate a crash. His wife insisted she heard a low screech echoing across the valley, like metal bending under unseen pressure. But during wartime, fear twisted every recollection, and those who dared speak of strange shapes or shadows were quickly dismissed as paranoid or delirious. German officers stationed nearby brushed off the villagers' claims, labeling them superstition born from fear, hunger, and the suffocating pressure of occupation. Reports weren't written. Statements weren't collected. Anything that contradicted official narratives was ignored. Yet the stories persisted, whispered in taverns over watered wine, murmured during evening prayers, traded between shepherds as they guided bleating flocks across frozen hillsides. A schoolteacher later recalled seeing a flicker in the sky, something that moved too deliberately to be falling debris, yet too silently to be a plane. She described it as a descending darkness, a phrase that would haunt her for decades. Still, no one investigated. No soldiers scoured the slopes. No scouts ventured into ravines where villagers claimed they saw tracks in fresh snow. Wartime logic was simple. If command said no plane crashed, then no plane crashed. Any evidence to the contrary was ignored, buried beneath fear of punishment and the oppressive weight of occupation. But the villagers remembered, long after soldiers marched away, long after snow erased footprints, long after Hans Keller's name faded from military records. Their stories remained quiet murmurs of a shadow swallowed by winter, a falling shape that left no trace, at least, not then. 79 years later, in the summer of 2023, the Alps were changing. Glaciers that had stood silent and immovable for millennia were retreating, cracking, and revealing secrets long entombed beneath layers of ancient ice. Two experienced climbers, a father and daughter team from Innsbruck, set out to summit a remote ridge above the Völunga Valley, an area rarely visited since the war. Their route took them across a thinning glacier scarred with deep fissures and streams of meltwater carving unstable paths beneath their crampons. Midway through the ascent, something metallic caught the daughter's eye, a twisted shard protruding from a blue-white wall of ice. At first glance, it looked like scrap from a modern helicopter rescue, littering the glacier from a training accident, but its shape was wrong. Its edges were too jagged, too weathered. Curious, they stepped closer. The glacier exhaled a cold wind across their faces, as if guarding a secret. They brushed at the frost with gloved hands, scraping back thick, stubborn layers of ice. More metal appeared, bent around itself like a crushed shell. A cylindrical object, perhaps a fuel tank, peeked through the translucent blue, but then came the detail that made them stop breathing. A faint outline. Black paint. A shape they recognized instantly. The faded remnants of a German Balkenkreuz, the Luftwaffe insignia. They stepped back instinctively, adrenaline surging through their veins. Here, entombed in ice older than both of them combined, was a piece of a World War II aircraft, buried deep enough to remain hidden for decades until the Earth itself began to warm and shift. The father steadied himself, staring at the insignia in disbelief. How many planes had disappeared without a trace in these mountains? How many stories had been swallowed by snow and silence? The climbers documented what they could, capturing photographs and GPS coordinates, but something about the scene felt sacred, untouched by time. As they cleared more ice, twisted struts, shattered fabric, and fragments of glass emerged like fossils being unearthed. It wasn't just debris, it was a grave. A frozen tomb holding the final chapter of a mystery nearly 8 decades old. The glacier had kept its secret long enough. Now, as the world warmed, it had begun to speak. News of the discovery spread quickly across the region, drawing a small team of investigators, alpine historians, and forensic experts to the remote glacier within days. Helicopters circled overhead, dropping equipment and personnel onto unstable ice that groaned beneath their boots. As the sun climbed higher, heat radiated against the glacier's surface, accelerating the melt. Each hour that passed revealed more of the aircraft, as if the mountain itself were reluctantly exhaling a secret it had guarded for nearly 80 years. A wing warped but unmistakably belonging to a Messerschmitt emerged first. Its aluminum skin was dulled and cracked, but still bore faint markings beneath layers of ice. A propeller soon followed, its blades twisted like metal ribbons, frozen mid-contortion. Fragments of glass lay scattered within the ice, each shard reflecting fractured sunlight, as though the glacier was littered with diamonds. But nothing prepared investigators for what lay deeper inside the glacial wall. As excavators worked with heated tools to gently melt away the surrounding ice, they uncovered the fuselage remarkably intact, not the twisted skeleton of a war-torn wreck, not the mangled heap expected from a high-impact crash. It sat preserved, eerily pristine, cocooned in blue ice that had shielded it from decay, wind, wildlife, and time itself. The metal bore no scorch marks, no signs of fire. The nose had minimal crumpling, suggesting the plane had impacted at low speed or glided into the glacier rather than slammed into it. Experts exchanged bewildered glances. Aircraft involved in mountain crashes usually shattered across fields of debris, scattering pieces for miles. Yet here, everything seemed frozen in place as if suspended mid-flight. One investigator noted that the fuselage's preservation bordered on unnatural, its rivets and seams appearing almost untouched, despite decades of pressure. The cockpit canopy, though fractured, was still connected by hinges hardened in ice. Even the interior instruments, a compass, altimeter, gauges, encrusted with frost, were visible through the cracks. It looked like a moment captured in amber, a time capsule sealed within frozen earth. How could a violent storm tear a pilot from the sky yet leave his aircraft so intact? That question gnawed at investigators as they pressed deeper into the fuselage, chipping away layers of crystalline ice. They braced themselves for answers or horrors that had been trapped with it since 1944. The glacier had revealed the aircraft. Now it was about to reveal its pilot. When the final slabs of ice were cleared from the cockpit, the excavation team fell silent. What lay inside felt less like wreckage and more like the frozen remnant of a story paused mid-sentence. Strapped tightly into the pilot's seat was a skeletal figure, preserved in a posture that suggested he had never attempted to escape. The bones were pressed forward slightly, chin tilted as if the pilot had been peering through the canopy at the exact moment of impact. Leather flight straps still crossed his chest, brittle but intact. Fragments of a wool uniform clung to the remains, the fabric stiffened by decades of sub-zero imprisonment. A freeze-dried glove still covered one skeletal hand, fingertips curled around the control column. For a long moment, no one spoke. The wind whistled across the glacier, a hollow, mournful sound that made the scene feel even more surreal. An investigator knelt forward cautiously, sweeping away loose snow that collected around the pilot's ribcage. His hand brushed against something small and metallic lying beneath the seat, a rusted oval plate, half buried in ice crystals. A dog tag. Its surface was weathered, pitted with corrosion, but a few letters remained etched in the metal. Keller, Hans. The name hung in the cold air like a ghost. There was no doubt. After 79 years, the cruel mystery that had consumed wartime officers, villagers, and historians had led here to a frozen cockpit, to a young pilot whose fate had been sealed beneath thick layers of ancient ice. The investigators exchanged looks of disbelief and sorrow. A life cut short, a story buried beneath snow, now resurrected by melting glaciers and shifting earth. As they carefully documented every bone, every scrap of fabric, every inch of the cockpit, more questions arose. The lack of trauma on the remains suggested Hans hadn't suffered violent impact injuries. His harness was intact. There were no fractures consistent with high-speed collision. Had he been injured before the crash? Had he lost consciousness? Why did he make no attempt to bail out? And how had his aircraft landed with such eerie precision amidst chaos? The dog tag confirmed his identity. But nothing else explained the mystery of how a man and machine could vanish so completely, only to reappear decades later, as if time itself had been holding its breath. While investigators pulled twisted metal from the ice and catalogued every rivet, the forensic team turned its focus to the cockpit interior. Beneath the seat, wedged tightly between the control column and the floor panel, they found something that did not belong to the aircraft itself. A small oilskin pouch, hardened with age, edges stiff with frozen moisture. When they pried it loose, the leather cracked in their gloved hands, releasing a brittle whisper of air trapped since 1944. Inside the pouch lay a journal. Not a formal flight log, but a personal notebook wrapped in leather, its corners darkened by oil, sweat, and time. Many pages were warped from moisture, fragile as dead leaves. Yet astonishingly, much of it remained legible. Hans Keller's handwriting, sharp, disciplined strokes traced the pages, chronicling his final days with meticulous detail. The first entries were routine, maintenance checks, engine performance, the usual frustrations of long reconnaissance flights. But as investigators flipped through, the tone shifted. Weather unstable, one entry read, cloud formations unusual, instruments unreliable. Another page was smudged with graphite and shaking lines, possibly written mid-flight. Compass fluctuating erratically, need to recalibrate, sky ahead, not normal. But it was the final section that froze investigators in their tracks. Hans described something he called Die Weiße Wand, the white wall. A curtain descending from above, he wrote. Not fog, not snow, something solid, light without source. He described clouds forming in impossible shapes, shifting faster than wind patterns allowed. Visibility narrowing until the world was nothing but blinding white. An unnatural silence, he wrote. Engine strain increasing, controls heavy, pressure in the cabin changing. One final line near the torn edge of the page read, "Something is wrong with the sky." Then the writing stopped abruptly, as if he had been interrupted. No conclusion. No farewell. Just a young pilot's frantic attempt to put into words something his training could not explain. The journal, sealed and preserved by ice, became the most valuable artifact of the entire discovery. It proved Hans did not simply fly into a routine storm. He encountered something so strange, so disorienting, that he documented it, even as danger closed in around him. The white curtain he described hinted at a phenomenon that science, weather records, and wartime reports had never acknowledged. But the deeper investigators read, the more one truth became impossible to ignore. Hans Keller sensed he was flying into something he was never meant to see. When Hans Keller's journal was compared with navigation records and the plane's final resting place, investigators uncovered one of the most baffling aspects of the entire case. Hans had not been anywhere near his assigned route when he vanished. Flight path reconstruction, based on atmospheric drift calculations, eyewitness accounts, and forensic analysis of the wreck, showed his aircraft had deviated nearly 80 kilometers east of his official mission corridor. Instead of following a clean arc northward over the Italian front, he had veered deep into hostile mountain territory, a region marked on wartime maps as unstable and unpredictable. Why? The deviation wasn't gradual. It was sharp, sudden, intentional, or forced, and given the malfunctioning instruments he described in his journal, investigators realized Hans may have lost navigational control long before his final transmission. Yet there was more. Another journal entry, scrawled in a hurried script, hinted at something ominous. "Shadow behind me," it read. "Too fast to be wind. Wings not like ours." The handwriting trembled across the page, the lines uneven, as if written while the aircraft shook or tilted. "Not enemy fighter," he added, "no sound." A second aircraft? Something following him? Investigators studied wartime records meticulously. No Allied aircraft were recorded in that sector at that time. No German patrols flew near his route. The skies were officially empty. Yet Hans wrote that he saw something. "Pursuit?" one analyst murmured while reviewing the entry. "Or hallucination?" But Hans's language lacked the erratic tone of a man losing consciousness. He wrote with precision, clarity, and fear-not confusion. Another faint annotation in the margin suggested the shape altered altitude rapidly. "It climbs without arc," Hans noted, "not aerodynamic." Though investigators hesitated to draw conclusions, the pattern was clear. Hans Keller believed he was not alone in the sky. Could whatever he saw have caused him to veer off route? Had the malfunction begun before he realized it? The reconstructed path showed a straight, unwavering trajectory into terrain no pilot would willingly enter. It was as if Hans was fleeing something or being drawn toward something that defied all known logic. The final kilometers of his path formed an eerie arrow pointing directly toward the glacier where he would ultimately be entombed. A path that made no strategic sense, no tactical sense, and no rational sense. Unless Hans Keller was not navigating by instruments or orders, but by fear. As the investigation deepened, researchers combed through wartime archives searching for anything, any scrap, any clue that might explain why Hans Keller veered so far off course and vanished into storm-shrouded mountains. It was during this exhaustive review that an archivist unearthed a collection of aerial reconnaissance photographs taken on the morning of Hans's disappearance. The photographs had been dismissed decades earlier as irrelevant, poorly developed, grainy, and lacking clarity. But now, illuminated under modern enhancement equipment, they revealed something that should never have been there. In one frame, Hans's Messerschmitt appears in the distance, its outline barely visible against the swirling fog, but behind it, partially obscured by cloud cover, is a second shape, blurred, elongated, too large to be debris yet too smooth to be a fighter. Historians crowded around the image, their voices hushed with disbelief. Possibly an Allied pursuit aircraft, one suggested, though no Allied unit reported flying in that airspace at that hour. Another theorized it could have been a weather balloon, yet the silhouette lacked the rounded form and suspension cables characteristic of balloon designs. Even more unsettling, the object appeared to hover in a way that defied known principles of flight. The photograph was taken mere minutes before Hans's final transmission, time-stamped with military precision. The shadow trailing him did not match any Luftwaffe aircraft model nor the profile of any known Allied plane. The object's outline was smooth, almost organic, its structure indistinct, as though wrapped in its own haze. In a subsequent frame taken seconds later, Hans's aircraft is visible again, but the strange object is now closer, its edges blurred by motion or distortion. The theories grew more frantic. A damaged fighter? A glider caught in downdraft? Atmospheric anomaly? But no hypothesis fit the physical scale, speed, or geometry seen on film. Old intelligence documents hinted that High Command had reviewed the photos at the time, but dismissed them as lens artifacts to avoid fueling rumors among the ranks. Yet Hans's journal entries describing a silent pursuer now aligned eerily with the blurred shape in the sky. What had once been dismissed as a smudge on film now became a chilling corroboration. Hans Keller wasn't alone in the sky that morning. Something uncharted flew behind him in the final minutes before his radio went dead. When forensic specialists finally conducted a complete structural analysis of Hans Keller's preserved aircraft, the discoveries challenged almost everything investigators thought they understood. In typical crash scenarios, impact forces tear through metal, shatter fuel tanks, rupture wings, and obliterate cockpit structures. But Hans's Messerschmitt defied these expectations. Inside the cockpit, instruments remained affixed in their original positions. The altimeter needle hovered at a reading that suggested a slow descent, not an uncontrolled plunge. The throttle was still half forward, frozen in place as if Hans never had the chance or the awareness to pull back. More unsettling. Fuel lines were intact, no evidence of fire, no ruptured tanks, no burn marks. The engine block, encased in frost, showed no signs of overheating or mechanical seizure. It was as though the aircraft simply stopped moving, arrested mid-flight by a force beyond its own momentum. Specialists surveyed the landing impact point between two ridges. The snow around the wreckage had been compressed, not gouged or plowed through. There were no deep furrows, no spray of metal fragments. This was not a violent crash. It was a controlled glide into death. Low-speed impact, the lead forensic engineer concluded. Very low speed, possibly a stall followed by a soft descent. But how could a falling plane descend gently in the middle of a superstorm? And why had Hans not attempted an emergency landing earlier while visibility allowed it? The glacier around the fuselage offered more clues. Seasonal layering showed the plane had landed within minutes of heavy snowfall, snow so fresh and thick that it buried the aircraft almost immediately. Without fire, smoke, or debris trails to betray its existence, the Messerschmitt was swallowed before the world could find it. It became a freeze frame of 1,944, the moment preserved perfectly in ice, suspended just as Hans left it. Investigators cataloged every untouched detail. Oxygen mask still clipped to its hook, emergency kit unopened, flight map rolled tightly in the side pocket. Nothing suggested panic. Nothing suggested struggle. It was as if the pilot had slipped into a moment of eerie stillness before the aircraft descended gently into the frozen earth. And in that stillness, in that snapshot of a moment lost to time, one haunting question remained. What force could bring a fighter plane to such a quiet, precise end without leaving a single mark of chaos behind? In a quiet neighborhood outside Munich, far from the roar of engines and the gnawing chill of mountain winds, Hans Keller's remaining family still kept a box of his letters, yellowed pages tied together with a ribbon that had once been white but had long since faded to the color of old bone. When investigators visited them in 2023, they found a family that had lived with unanswered questions for nearly 8 decades. Hans's younger sister, now in her 90s, sat wrapped in a shawl, her frail fingers trembling as she opened the box that had haunted her since she was a teenager. Inside were letters Hans had sent in the days before his final flight, letters that, when read aloud, felt like the voice of a man wrestling with doubts bigger than war itself. "Training feels different now," Hans wrote in one. "Orders come fast, with little explanation. They send us north one day, east the next. No logic to it." Another letter revealed exhaustion beneath his disciplined script. "The sky is playing tricks. Clouds form where they shouldn't. Instruments behave strangely. I'm tired, and something feels off." But it was the final letter, dated just 3 days before his disappearance, that left investigators rattled. Hans wrote, "New orders came today. They make no sense, no explanation, no reason given. They want me to fly a route no one has flown before. Why? We are pilots, not pawns." He ended the letter abruptly, as though someone had entered the room mid-sentence. His sister remembered reading it by candlelight the night it arrived, feeling a knot tighten in her stomach. She had always sensed those words were a warning, a plea he could not voice openly. Hans's parents never accepted his official status as missing, presumed dead. His mother kept a candle burning in the window until her final days, convinced he would return, convinced that something unsaid, something monstrous, had taken him. His father, a stoic man hardened by war, quietly blamed the military for sending their son on missions cloaked in secrecy. "They knew more than they told," he would mutter to anyone who would listen. Decades passed, generations came and went, but the family never stopped wondering what became of Hans. And when news finally arrived in 2023 that the glacier had given up its long-held secret, the family felt both relief and dread. Relief that Hans had been found. Dread that the truth, whatever it was, might be more terrifying than anything they had imagined. The excavation team thought they had uncovered everything: the fuselage, the cockpit, the skeleton still strapped in place. But glaciers are unpredictable, shifting like living beasts beneath sun and storm, and as late summer heat intensified, more ice began to buckle and crack around the site. With every thaw, new fragments surfaced, twisted metal torn in ways no ordinary crash could explain. One shard bore markings that baffled engineers, symbols etched into the metal that didn't match wartime manufacturing codes, maintenance stamps, or serial numbers. Intricate lines intersected at sharp angles, almost geometric, unlike anything produced in German factories of the era. Investigators argued whether the marks were war damage or something else, something added later, but then came the discovery that froze them in their tracks: a second parachute harness. Wedged between two slabs of ancient ice, half buried in glistening frost, was a full harness, buckles intact, straps preserved like leather frozen in time. Analysts stared at it in disbelief. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 was a single-seat fighter. One pilot, one cockpit, one harness. Yet here lay a second. "Impossible," one investigator whispered. "There is nowhere for a second person to sit." The discovery raised questions that fractured the investigation. Had Hans disobeyed orders and taken someone on board? A mechanic? An intelligence officer? A prisoner? Or was the harness from another aircraft entirely, one that crashed nearby but had never been found? But the metal fragments surrounding the harness didn't match the Messerschmitt, and yet they weren't identifiable as any other known design, German or Allied. As experts lifted the harness from its icy grave, a chilling possibility emerged. What if someone or something had been inside that cockpit with Hans? What if the storm, the strange object captured in aerial photographs, and the deviations in his flight path weren't random? What if Hans wasn't alone in the sky, and not alone when the aircraft descended into the glacier? Meltwater dripped steadily, whispering over the wreckage like a warning. The glacier had given up another secret. But the answers it revealed only deepened the darkness surrounding Hans Keller's final flight. As the pieces of Hans Keller's frozen story were laid out across tables in the temporary Alpine Command tent, photographs, journal excerpts, spectral fragments of metal, a second harness that shouldn't exist, experts from multiple fields convened to construct their theories. Each theory attempted to trace back through 79 years of cold silence, through layers of ice and secrecy, through fear, through war. But none could fully explain what happened in that brief, fateful moment when Hans Keller vanished into the storm. The most conventional explanation came first: a catastrophic navigational failure. Specialists pointed to the journal entries describing malfunctioning instruments, the compass swinging wildly, gauges fluctuating without reason. In a time when aircraft relied heavily on mechanical precision, a single instrument failure could send a pilot into deadly terrain. But this theory faltered against the forensic evidence. The instruments inside the cockpit were intact. The dials frozen mid-reading suggested not a mechanical collapse but a sudden interruption, like a force had halted everything at once. The second theory focused on pursuit by Allied fighters. The grainy aerial photographs showing a blurred object behind Hans's aircraft fueled this idea. Historians debated whether it might have been a British or American reconnaissance plane operating off-record, tracking him for reasons unknown. Perhaps Hans dove into the mountains to escape, flying lower and lower until cloud cover swallowed him. But no Allied records corroborated such a mission that day. No pilot reported sighting a Messerschmitt skimming alpine peaks, and the object's shape, if it was an aircraft, didn't match known silhouettes. Then came the meteorological theory. Extreme weather, sudden whiteout conditions, unpredictable wind shear phenomena common in the Alps. Hans himself described a white curtain, a descending wall that stole his horizon. Meteorologists argued he became disoriented, losing situational awareness and gliding unknowingly toward the glacier. Yet experts countered. Even in disorientation, instinct and training drove pilots to pull up, to climb, to fight. Hans never did. His descent was controlled, calm, almost deliberate. The most controversial theory proposed that Hans had been assigned a classified mission, one hidden behind the orders that make no sense he wrote about. Intelligence officers in 1944 may have sent him toward an experimental test site, or to intercept something they feared. Perhaps Hans saw more than he was meant to. Perhaps the military silenced the truth to avoid panic or exposure. But again, no definitive records survived, only whispers from aged relatives and a sealed file stamped Hochgeheim. So why didn't Hans turn toward safety? Why didn't he climb above the storm? Why did he fly straight into the glacier as if drawn toward it? No one could say. The wreckage preserved details but not answers. The glacier sealed the moment but not the meaning. The cockpit told a story frozen in time but missing the final chapter. And as investigators left the mountain for the last time, the wind howled across the ice, a reminder that the Alps keep their secrets well. Hans Keller's aircraft was found, his remains identified, his journal preserved, but the truth of what happened in his final minutes remained swallowed by clouds, by storm, by something larger than war. A mystery frozen for 79 years, and perhaps forever. This story was intense, but this story on the right-hand side is even more insane.